Hi, everyone. I'm thrilled to be here today with a friend of 20 years. I was just looking at that today. And not only is she a friend, but she's going to be a great guest for our podcast. She has some wonderful experience that I know will help our audience in some very interesting ways relative to the pharmaceutical industry. And I know that's a hot topic in the press. But there's a lot of misunderstanding about what certain things are, and we're going to clear some of those up today. So let me start up by welcoming Deb Alper.
Thank you, TJ. Happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
My pleasure. Deb has experience as Director of Global Strategic Marketing in Oncology with Johnson & Johnson, or a division of Johnson & Johnson. And prior to that, she's had experience in respiratory, rheumatology, cardiology for companies of the likes of Roche and Shearing. And so today we're going to be talking about two overall categories, one being patient assistance programs and the other one being clinical trials. Deb, why don't we start out with, which would you say, patient assistance programs or clinical trials?
Let's start with the patient assistant programs.
Super. Okay. So my first question for you is, where do patient assistance programs come from?
So they are a free service directly from the pharmaceutical companies. It's not mandated by the government or any state organization. So it's good to keep in mind that different companies call the program by different names. I've heard them called medication assistant programs, as well as charitable drug programs.
So how do people find these programs?
So I think the easiest way is to first figure out the name of the pharmaceutical company that sells the drug, because typically you're going to have a drug that you're going to want to get help for. And what I did was I just Googled the name of the drug and then after it, patient assistant program. And you can also call the manufacturer of the drug and ask if they have patient assistant programs. There is also a website that you can go to, which I think it's kind of long, so you may want to put it underneath, but you can also go to worldwidewebmedicare.gov, plan/compare, and look for the pharmaceutical assistant program link.
How do these programs work?
So they're basically designed for low income or underinsured or uninsured patients. A patient can either receive free medication or medication at a reduced cost. Each program operates differently because it is a self-imposed program. And I believe patients may also need to be a U.S. resident, but you really need to check with each program. They all work a little bit differently. My stepmother, who I was helping out, qualified because both my stepmother and my father have been retired and living on a retirement income. So she qualified.
The process of applying for one of these, it's just online, they can click on a link and start the process, or do they have to actually call?
You definitely need to give a call. In my particular case, you may be able to you can probably go online as well and fill it out, but I think it's better to talk to a person and be on the safe side because they can also give you pointers and tips.
Absolutely. Are there programs for all diseases?
Well, it's typically going to be mainly designed for the popular drugs. So not every disease, not every drug. However, being that I worked in the industry for many decades, I would say if one's physician states a drug is needed and you can't afford it, and there are no patient assistant programs for that particular drug, I personally would contact the pharmaceutical company anyway and ask if they could provide some relief in terms of funding. And I think your best bet on doing that is to try and speak with someone in what's called the medical affairs department. That would be your best bet.
Question just came to mind off of the outline that we've gone through, which is, excuse me, what is the timeline from beginning of the process to, okay, getting either a no or a yes? And I understand it could be a different length of time.
Yeah, sure. It totally can vary depending upon the company, the program, how much, funding they're putting into it. But in my particular case, um, when so like I'll just expand and give you the example because my stepmother had Parkinson's and she was on Nuplazid, and that's a drug marketed by Acadia Pharmaceuticals, and they're located out in San Diego, California. Um, it was going to cost them about $3,000 per month. And the neurologist suggested that my stepmother try it, but was able to secure them a discount. So if you want to include that timing, you know, the doctor going through paperwork and trying to get it, that can be a couple weeks. And so what happened was I checked into it as mentioned, and it turned out that they were offering medication for free for up to 1 year. If you qualified. So I filled out the application, which was to determine income, ability to pay. So however long it takes you to fill that out, I had to get the application, go to my dad's house, get all his cards and different forms. We had to provide a social security benefit statement, health insurance information. And then, so that took a couple weeks. And then, you could also fill that out in one day. And then the neurologist also had to fill out paperwork. So in this case, to be prescribed Nuplazid, insurance required a prior authorization. So that's what the MD had to attest to, along with a script and a diagnosis that he had to send in on his side. So I would say from the time that I sent mine in and then called his office to remind them to get that in, it was by the time we got the drug the first time, after we were authorized, it took about a month. But when I did speak to Acadia, they said, oh, well, if this is going to take, this may take a while. It'll take us 14 days to ship. But what I can do is I can give you a 1 week supply now, and then we'll see what happens, like if you get approved or not, just to get her started. So I didn't accept that because you want someone to be on drug consistently. So I think that there's all sorts of workarounds. The other thing I wanted to mention was that the drug was distributed by Walgreens Alliance RX program. So it was covered. So we ended up filling out the paperwork and being covered, but we ended up being charged a $44 copay for a 30-day supply. So during this whole conversation and all of this, this is why I'm saying to call is better. You can definitely go online, but we were also offered, when we found out what the copay was, because the company called us back. The company, Acadia, called us back and said, oh, you're going to end up having a copay. They were helping me work through the distribution with Walgreens. And they said, basically, there is also a government program you can apply to get assistance on the copay, right? But my parents were able to manage the $44 copay. And we felt really lucky because the copay range for a $3,000 drug in this particular case ran as high as $500. And I think that they weigh that, or they put that against your income, and so on. So I guess they happen to have an income that put them in the lower range, but you can, it's $500 copay is better than $3,000 a month for a drug, but I still think 500 is a bit high. I think that's why they had offered, another application process to apply to get that copay down. So it's a lot of work, but I think it's worth it.
So there's some other questions that came to mind based upon what you were saying. So in terms of, you had mentioned a couple things I just want to clarify for the audience and for myself. You said it's typically popular drugs. From what I remember, it could also be like a novel drug, one that's just, it's a niche. It's just
Sure.
a very small disease state. Somebody whose it's helping maybe tens of thousands of people. hundreds of
Mhm.
thousands rather than millions. A similar type of process. Some of those may have programs as well.
Yeah, they may have programs. And by popular drugs, I guess, maybe I should clarify to say popular within that disease state. So it can be by any drug company. So um, there are orphan drug, as you mentioned, diseases that are very small. But if that drug is the only drug, and it's for that condition, and it's very expensive, it's really, again, up to the pharmaceutical company if they want to put a program in place. So it's really, maybe pharma companies will pick a couple of their most popular drugs.
And you would mention that sometimes people can get the assistance, maybe it's free for up to a year. What happens after a year?
Yeah, that's a good question. We never made the year, but it turned out that that my stepmother's disease progressed within that time frame, so she benefited while she could from that drug. So after that year, I don't know specifically because I hadn't been through that year, and I don't know if all of them, if it was just Acadia that put a 1 year cap on it or not, but you'd really have to go back and check. I mean, my guess would be there would be some sort of assistance because they're not going to want to lose a patient. And also, it's really bad form to, if someone's dependent upon a drug, to not allow a patient to continue.
What happens if somebody starts the drug and then it's not working? They have an adverse reaction, their lab work's coming back. It's not what goes on at that point?
Yeah, that happens. I mean, the patient would have to come off of the drug. And I would recommend for a patient to then go back to they should be working with their physician the whole time on this. Um, and their physician should be aware of this. And every time we ordered, every month, I had to answer a questionnaire. So before they would ship the drug, has there been any change? They gave pharmaceutical assistance. So you could speak with anytime if there was a drug reaction, if you couldn't get a hold of your doctor, which I would always recommend you talk to your doctor. They also, through this Alliance program, would put you on the phone with a pharmacist who you would talk to, and they would take you through everything and how to handle it. They always ask me, side effects. Has there been any changes in other medications? Because they always want to know what are the co-medications, because Parkinson's patients are on multiple drugs.
Yeah, and I go through a similar thing with both of my parents because they're both getting infusions. One's getting it my mom's getting weekly infusions of Hizentra, which is not, I guess, would classify under a patient assistance covered by Medicare and a supplemental insurance, but just relative to the questions that are constantly asked. Has there been a change in health? Have there been any other medications added, et cetera? The big question that people want to know before they consider this, whether it's a patient advocate, caregiver, or the patient themselves, is what are the pros and cons?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I feel the pros outweigh the cons in this case, but the cons are the paperwork, waiting for approval, as we talked about earlier, and I think just the follow-up that you have to do with your own physician's office to make sure that they've done everything properly on their end. Sometimes just filling out the form slightly wrong, I mean, will cause a delay. So I think that those are important, and you may not get as much of a discount as you want. But the pros, really, it shouldn't be too difficult for retired or unemployed people to qualify for a discount. And for me, the pro is being able to try a new drug for the condition, and it's really all about hope.
So let's move on to clinical trials. They've been known, I think, forever. They hear the word clinical trials has been thrown out there. And I think during COVID, because of the COVID vaccine and monoclonal antibodies and so forth, it's now out in the mainstream, which can lead to, and I think to an extent has led to, a lot of misunderstanding about what they are. So can you share with us what are clinical trials?
Yeah, I mean, clinical trials are designed to prospectively test a drug to determine if it has health benefits in specific patient population. So the patients are all volunteers. And the organizations that conduct clinical trials, such as the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, the WHO, the World Health Organization, etc., they're all required to follow protocols or regulations while conducting the trials. Um, so they have what's known as eligibility criteria, which is like inclusion exclusion criteria that determine which patients or volunteers can or can't participate in the study. So it needs to be very specific to properly assess the drug's capability. There's phases of testing, and they differ a bit depending upon the disease, but as a high overview and in a very general sense, typically a phase 1 trial is for safety and to figure out the proper dose. A phase 2 trial is often about efficacy of that dose. And phase 3 is typically comparing the clinical trial drug to a current standard of care.
For the audience, can you just define efficacy? It's another word that's just thrown out there all the time, and I don't think a lot of people really know what that means.
Okay, so efficacy of a drug is just to see how well does it work. Is it, are you making any progress on the disease with that drug? And that's part of the reason why they do the phase, even though phase 2 will show efficacy, what happens in the phase 3 when you compare the outcomes of a drug in safety and how well it works to a standard of care, what's already on the market. So that's why those phase 3 drugs are really important, because it'll actually tell you, compared to what we know today, this drug will, make you feel, it quantifies how much better it is.
Can you speak at a high level without getting into a lot of detail, because I know we could, talk about, again, for the audience, again, because a lot of stuff's been thrown out there over the past 3 years, how stringent the protocols are.
Well, the protocols have to be pretty stringent. I mean, I can tell you that if they don't, uh, if it, so they have to be stringent, because really what's important is you have to test like the pharmacokinetics and the pharmacodynamics. So that basically means, what is your body doing to the drug and what is your drug doing to the body? And so they have to make it pretty strict to make sure we're understanding exactly what's happening with the drug. But I'll give you an example. My aunt was told, okay, we're going to put you, she was sick, cancer, we're going to put you on a clinical trial. So she was very hopeful and excited and looking forward to it. They have to run tests, make sure they figure out how all your organs are functioning because of the criteria to get into a clinical trial. And then they told her, she was very upset. They told her, well, you can't join the clinical trial because your pancreas doesn't function fully. And, part of this drug, she called me, she was really upset. And I said, no, it's okay. You don't want to be on the drug. It's not that they're rejecting you. It's just that it more than likely this drug is, and I could be wrong in her case, but more than likely the drug is excreted through the pancreas. And so her pancreas couldn't handle it. And they didn't want her to get more sick just from being on this clinical trial. Well, the other reason would be that if they let someone in who shouldn't be in the trial and the protocol isn't followed, the drug won't get approved. It will never get on the market, because of they need to really have full understanding and be able to analyze all of the data.
That's helpful. That definitely helps. So when does it make sense for someone to consider a clinical trial?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the main reason to enlist in a clinical trial is because a patient doesn't have a drug regimen that works well for them. It could be a patient who has tried all the standard of care or approved treatments for their condition, and the treatments no longer work or have failed them. And also, if a patient is having, even if bad side effects with existing medications, and maybe not getting a decent quality of life or reaching the full potential of the drug's efficacy due to maybe having to stop taking the meds because of the side effects. Um, you know, it's really, of course, a physician can also recommend it, but it's helpful for a patient, or more typically even the caregiver, to understand the overall course of the disease and the strategy for treating it. So if you get that really big picture when your loved one is like first entering into a disease state, have strategy conversations with the doctor, I think that helps you figure out, should I be looking for clinical trials or should I not? Because perhaps, match that with what the patient wants for their future. That would be another way to, like I said, to determine the trigger. It's about timing. So a trial may not be available when you want to join one. And there's also eligibility requirements. So there's a lot of things to consider.
There are a lot of things to consider. How do people find out about if a trial is available?
Yeah, so I think the most obvious way I would first ask my physician, or ask your physician if they know of or are willing to help guide you. The treating physician is really most familiar with your condition and should understand the basics of clinical trials. So if nothing else, they may be able to recommend drug categories that you can research, and maybe even specific resources. Other options are to check with the organizations that run clinical trials, such as pharma companies or the NIH, the National Institute of Health. Even some individual physicians will play their hand at running small clinical trials. I mean, for me, my go-to is clinicaltrials.gov to learn about trials. They cover all diseases and devices. And I believe the US passed a law, around 2007 or so, that requires that most drugs register for that site and submit summary results for all their trials. The FDA does have a more simple way to search the website, which I think I'll probably send you the link. It's like worldwideweb.fda.gov/patients/clinical trials, what patients need to know, all hyphenated. So, but specifically, there's other ways to search. So for cancer-related trials, you can go to the website or call the National Cancer Institute directly. For AIDS, there's an actis.org website. And you can always try the individual pharma sites for trials. There's also an organization, as you kind of alluded to earlier, they're called NORD, the National Organization for Rare Disorders, and they may be able to direct you to a rare disease trials or to specific organizations that run trials. So you can always, pick up the phone and call NORD if you have a niche condition, because I used to work with them on a couple of drugs that I worked on, and they're really good. One thing to think about too is, like we said, it's hit or miss with clinical trials. If for other reasons you can't get into a clinical trial for what we mentioned earlier, and you did research and you truly believe, and your MD also truly believes that a particular drug could really be of benefit for you. I'm not saying this could happen, but it would depend upon the status of the drug, meaning where is it in clinical trials? Is it already on the market for another indication? That's important to know. But my suggestion would be contact the pharma company for access to the drug based upon something called compassionate use. In this case, your physician would really need to advocate for you and do a bit of paperwork if they're willing, because it's a time suck. But if it's on the market for another indication, it would be much less risky for you to be granted access. So there's a lot of detail there. Again, like strict protocols, reasons why you would or wouldn't be granted access. But if it's still in clinical trials, it's definitely going to be more difficult. But because of the protocols that drugs that haven't been approved have to follow. If those lines are blurred, you can just put the drug at higher risk for approval. But it doesn't hurt to call and ask, because they may be able to work something out. And if not, they may be able to refer you to someone who could help.
So you've answered many of the questions. But there's one overall which you've touched on, but maybe if we can bring it back around and together, the role of the doctor in all of this. So let's put it this way: in an ideal world, what would be the doctor's role from beginning through the trial? And in a minimum role, what do they have to be involved with?
So when a patient agrees to go into a clinical trial, really, unless your physician is personally involved in the clinical trial, meaning they are at an active clinical trial site, recruiting and treating patients in that particular trial, then essentially, unless the patient involves the MD is not kept in the loop of a clinical trial. And as a patient as well, you're agreeing to be treated by the center conducting the trial, and whomever is running the site becomes your new physician. As a patient, you agree to travel to the new site, you undergo whatever treatment they're providing. There's paperwork involved, there's a contract, so you have to sign it. And you're saying, okay, this is now my new treatment plan. And it's good to understand what you cover, what they cover. Sometimes benefits of clinical trials are that, a lot of it's paid for, but you may be required to pay for some things. And there's going to be checkups and visits that they need you to come in for to monitor the drug. So you're agreeing to all of this. So unless you're calling your doctor and keeping them in the loop, or your doctor, like I said, is in the clinical trial, or your doctor knows people that are running the trial, you're pretty much getting a new doctor for this part of the treatment plan. Like, it's very important to understand that the clinical trial does have a goal. And so when my family and friends ask me, you know a lot about this, should I join this clinical trial? Should my dad join this clinical trial? I get calls. My aunt called, should your uncle join this trial? What I always do is I ask them, one, send me the protocol so that I can read exactly what they're testing and exactly what their goals are. And two, tell me, what is your hope? What do you hope to achieve as the outcome of this trial? And then I compare the two, and I let them know how I see their expectations aligning.
Very interesting. That's a very interesting point. I want to go back to the point of the doctor and having basically a new doctor or a new set of clinicians that are taking care of them. What happens if that person has numerous comorbidities, issues, healthcare issues, and they have other doctors involved? How does that team handle that as well, or how does that all happen?
Well, that's going to be determined under the inclusion-exclusion criteria. So if they do have the comorbidities, it would be part of the eligibility criteria, and the clinical trial would be set up to accommodate that.
Okay. Interesting. Well, that's helpful to know for sure, because that's a question that I'm sure many people have. So finally, just to bring it back around, relative to the patient assistance programs and the clinical trials, is there any overarching advice you would give to patient advocates, caregivers, and patients when you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important to understand the disease overall, where your loved one is in the course of the disease. I think that that's really helpful. Knowing who your doctor is and where your doctor stands in the community may be something else we haven't mentioned yet. If your physician is just local and that's convenient, and that works for you and you like them, that's fine. It's good to know that. And it's good to know which physicians follow others, because there is an order of information flow out there in terms of doctors. And so there are many doctors who are PIs, principal investigators, and they're also known as key opinion leaders or opinion leaders, and they'll work with new drugs, or even older drugs that are, you know, that work well. Know your doctor. Know, have they been in a clinical trial? Have they run clinical trials? Do they go to conferences every year? Because every year there is conferences for physicians that talk about all the new treatments. So I would say know who your doctor is, know what they know, um, and also know about all the organizations that are out there for your loved one's disease states, because being connected with those organizations, whether it be, a breast cancer organization or a lymphoma organization or NORD, um, they all have, not all, but many of them have patient summits, yearly patient summits. And those are great things to go to because you learn about other folks, what they're going through, what they've tried, and you learn about anything new that's coming out to the market. You've got people to talk to, um, who you can, get advice from.
No, that's great. That's really helpful, especially the patient forums, the patient conferences that they can go to learn. That's incredibly helpful. And I'm sure many of those are online now,
Yes.
which is just makes it so much easier for folks. So, well, Deb, this has been a fun ride. And thanks so much. I really appreciate you being here and sharing your knowledge. You have a lot of it.
Thanks for having me, TJ.
You're welcome. Take care.
Bye.
The primary purpose of the podcast is to educate. While guests are invited to listen, listeners acknowledge that they are not being provided professional advice from the podcast or any guests. One Day, One Week and its sponsor, 17 Commerce LLC, expressly disclaim any and all liability or responsibility for any direct, indirect, incidental, special, consequential, or other damages arising out of any individual's use of, reference to, reliance on, or inability to use the podcast episodes or the information presented in the episodes.